October 1987, Ector County, Texas. The air was thin and carried the scent of dust and crude oil. A permanent haze hung low on the horizon, a testament to the pump jacks that moved in their slow, ceaseless rhythm, pulling the lifeblood from the Permian Basin. It was a land of hard sun and harder realities, a land where wealth was measured in barrels per day, and a man's worth was tied to the patch of dirt he worked or the rig he worked upon. The ground was caliche, stubborn and white, punctuated by mesquite and the occasional resilient patch of grama grass. To the east lay the lights of Odessa, a city built on the black gold beneath. To the west, nothing but the long, flat expanse stretching toward the New Mexico border. This was a place that understood one thing: oil. Ilara Finch was 58 years old, a widow for 14 months. She lived on a section of land known locally as the Finch Tract, a parcel her husband's family had run a few dozen head of cattle on since the 1930s. It was poor land. Everyone knew it was poor land. It sat on the wrong side of the Goldsmith Fault, a geological dead end where the rich, oil-bearing formations of the basin gave way to shallow, worthless strata. John Finch had known it. His father had known it. They had scratched a living from it, their knuckles raw, their faces etched by sun and worry. They never drilled. There was no point. The majors had surveyed it in the 50s. The wildcatters had sniffed around it in the 70s. The consensus was written in stone, passed down in the coffee shops and the supply yards. The Finch Tract was dry. But in that dry October of 1987, Ilara Finch did something that made no sense. She did not hire a drilling crew. She did not bring in a seismology team to look for a phantom pocket of gas. She hired 2 men and a strange machine from the Colorado School of Mines. The machine was not a towering derrick. It was a compact tracked vehicle called a geoprobe, 662 ODT. It did not drill for oil. It took soil samples, core samples. For 3 weeks, the 2 quiet geologists from Golden, Colorado, worked under the relentless Texas sun. They were methodical, precise. They laid out a grid on Ilara's poorest pasture, the one where even the mesquite struggled to grow. They drove the geoprobe's hydraulic hammer into the earth, again and again, pulling up perfect cylinders of soil and rock in clear acetate sleeves. They worked in silence, labeling each core with a grease pencil: depth, grid coordinate, time of day. They filled 112 sleeves in total, each one 5 feet long. They packed them carefully into insulated shipping crates, cushioned with foam and dry ice. The men of the county watched from the road. They slowed their Ford and Chevy pickups, kicking up clouds of white dust. They saw the strange machine, the quiet academics, the woman standing alone by the fence line, her arms crossed, watching the work with an unreadable expression. They had one word for it: grief. The cost of the survey was $48,750. This was not a rumor. This was a fact, learned from a clerk at the Odessa National Bank, where Ilara had deposited the check from John's life insurance policy, and then, a week later, withdrawn a cashier's check made out to a geological services firm. The number traveled through the county like a brush fire. $48,000, nearly $50,000, poured directly into the driest patch of dirt in West Texas. The money was John's legacy. It was meant to be her security. It was the sum total of a man's life of hard work, of premiums paid quarterly without fail, of a quiet promise to take care of her after he was gone. It was not a fortune, not in a land of oil barons, but it was enough. Enough to live on, enough to fix the roof and pay the taxes, and never have to ask for help. She spent almost all of it on dirt, on 112 plastic tubes of worthless Ector County soil. The samples were shipped by secured freight to a specialized laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place that had nothing to do with oil and gas, a place that analyzed materials for aerospace companies and electronics manufacturers. The shipping alone cost more than $3,000. The analysis, a complex process involving mass spectrometry and X-ray diffraction, accounted for the rest. Ilara Finch did not sell the remaining cattle. She did not lease her mineral rights for the paltry $1-an-acre fee some speculator might have offered out of pity. She waited. She repaired her own fences with wire she bought on credit at the feed store. She patched the tires on John's old pickup herself. She tended a small vegetable garden behind the clapboard house, coaxing tomatoes and okra from the unforgiving soil. She lived on what the garden gave her, on the dwindling funds in her checking account, on a stubbornness that baffled everyone. The community's reaction was swift. It was uniform. It was not malicious, not exactly. It was a confusion that curdled into a kind of weary pity. It was the collective headshake of a people who understood the rules of their world and saw a woman who had decided to break them for no discernible reason. At the Feed and Supply in Gardendale, the talk was practical. The ranchers, their faces creased like old leather, discussed the matter over bags of sweet feed and spools of barbed wire. They talked about what that money could have bought: a new tractor, a reliable well pump, 1,000 acres of decent grazing land up in Gaines County, to spend it on a soil test, not for water, not for oil, but for something nobody could even name, was an offense against common sense. It was poor stewardship. It was a waste. In the Petroleum Club on the top floor of the building in downtown Odessa, the oilmen laughed. These were men who gambled millions on a hunch, who drilled dry holes and never flinched. They understood risk. But this was not risk. This was folly. They knew that land. Their companies had the seismic maps, the geological surveys going back half a century. They could tell you the exact depth of the Permian limestone, the thickness of the San Andres Formation, the utter lack of any promising structure beneath the Finch Tract. They saw her act as an amateur's delusion, the kind of thing an outsider might do, someone who didn't understand the unforgiving geology of the basin. They ordered another round of drinks and dismissed it. At the First Baptist Church, the women spoke in hushed tones in the fellowship hall after service. They organized a casserole drive. They brought Ilara macaroni and cheese, green bean bake, potato salad. They saw her thinness, the new lines around her eyes, and they diagnosed her condition with certainty: a broken heart, a mind unmoored by loss. John's death had been sudden, a heart attack while mending a fence. She was alone in that old house, and her grief had found a strange and expensive outlet. The soil test was a cry for help, they decided, a project to fill the empty days. They prayed for her. They prayed for her soul and for her finances. The talk was everywhere, in the aisles of the grocery store, at the counter of the post office, in the waiting room of the auto mechanic. The story became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale. Ilara's folly, they called it. The phrase stuck. It was a shorthand for irrational hope, for throwing good money after bad. Teenagers used it. A boy who spent his summer wages on a broken-down Mustang was chasing Ilara's folly. A farmer who planted cotton in a drought year was planting Ilara's folly. The name attached itself to the land, to the woman, to the act itself, defining her in the eyes of the entire county. She had become the pragmatic maverick, the misunderstood visionary, but they saw her only as the grieving widow. Her self-reliance was mistaken for isolation. Her quiet competence was read as eccentricity. Her singular, focused action was dismissed as a symptom of a troubled mind. She asked for no help. She offered no explanations. When a neighbor asked her what the scientists were looking for, she had given a single, unhelpful answer. Answers. The report from the lab in Massachusetts arrived 2 months later, just before Christmas. It came in a heavy cardboard box delivered by a private courier. The mailman, who knew everyone's business, noted that it was too heavy to be just paper. Inside was a 300-page bound document filled with charts, graphs, and chemical analyses that would have been meaningless to anyone in Ector County. And there were 12 small, velvet-lined cases, each containing a polished stone, a cross-section of one of the core samples. Ilara Finch signed for the package. She took it inside. She did not speak of its contents to anyone. The folly was complete. The money was gone. And nothing changed. The pump jacks on the neighboring properties continued their slow dance. The seasons turned. The talk eventually died down, replaced by newer gossip, by the fluctuating price of oil, by the high school football team's chances at state. Ilara and her folly were absorbed into the landscape, a fixed point of local curiosity, a story told to newcomers to explain the character of the place. The justification for the community's disbelief was not born of ignorance. It was born of deep, hard-won knowledge. It was rooted in the very history of the land they occupied. The conventional wisdom of Ector County was not a matter of opinion. It was a proven fact, written in oil and steel across the vast expanse of the Permian Basin. The story began in 1923 with the Santa Rita No. 1 well in Reagan County, a gusher that blew in and proved the existence of a sea of oil beneath the West Texas desert. That discovery triggered a rush that dwarfed the gold rushes of the previous century. Men came from all over the country, wildcatters and roughnecks, geologists and speculators. They came with rusty equipment and boundless optimism. They learned the land the hard way, by drilling dry holes, by going broke, by studying the rock and the sand and the subtle shifts in the earth. By the 1980s, the basin was one of the most thoroughly explored and understood petroleum regions on the planet. Generations of geologists had mapped its every fault, its every anticline, its every salt dome. The science was settled. Oil was found in specific formations: the Sprayberry, the Wolf Camp, the Clear Fork. These were ancient seabeds and reefs, layers of porous rock where organic matter had been cooked under pressure for millions of years into black crude. You drilled into those formations. It was that simple. The Finch Tract had none of them. It was a geological anomaly, a raised block of uselessness. The valuable formations were thousands of feet deeper there, far beyond the reach of profitable drilling. Or they were absent entirely, pushed aside by the tectonic shrug of the Goldsmith Fault. What lay near the surface was caliche and redbed clay, and the shallow, waterlogged limestone of the San Andres Formation, known for being stubbornly, frustratingly barren of hydrocarbons. To drill there for oil was a fool's errand. Every local knew this. Furthermore, the timing of Elara's folly made it seem even more nonsensical. The mid-1980s were a time of catastrophic bust for the oil industry. After the boom of the late 70s, a global oil glut had sent prices plummeting. In 1986, the price of West Texas Intermediate crude had collapsed from nearly $30 a barrel to below $10. The effect on the Permian Basin was devastating. Drilling rigs were idled. Companies went bankrupt overnight. Roughnecks and engineers who had been making fortunes were suddenly out of work, their brand-new pickup trucks being repossessed. The boomtown optimism of Odessa and Midland evaporated, replaced by a grim, anxious silence. For sale signs sprouted like weeds in front of half-finished mansions. The motto of the era, seen on bumper stickers, was, "Please, God, just give me one more boom. I promise not to piss it away this time." In this economic climate, survival meant caution. It meant sticking to what you knew. It meant drilling only in the most promising locations, using the most proven techniques. It meant cutting every unnecessary expense. To spend $50,000 on a speculative, non-oil-related geological survey of a piece of worthless land was not just foolish. It was an act of financial insanity. It was spitting in the face of the economic hurricane that was tearing their world apart. The men of the county, the ones who ran the crews and signed the checks, saw her actions as a personal affront to their expertise. They had spent their lives learning the difficult language of the basin, the subtle signs that pointed to wealth buried deep underground. They could read a seismic chart like a newspaper. They could tell the difference between drilling mud from the wolf camp and the sprayberry by its smell. They had earned their knowledge through failure, through dry holes that cost them everything. And this woman, this rancher's widow, was ignoring all of it. She was acting as if their entire body of collective knowledge was worthless. And so they settled on the only explanation that made sense, the one that preserved their worldview: grief. It was a powerful force. It could make people do strange things. They all knew stories. The man who kept his wife's room exactly as it was the day she died, for 20 years. The woman who started talking to her cats as if they were her children. Elara Finch's folly was just another story for the collection. Her husband, John, had been a sensible, grounded man. He knew his land was poor. He never wasted a dime on wild dreams. He ran his cattle, paid his bills, and accepted his lot. This project of hers, this bizarre scientific expedition, was a rejection of his pragmatism. In their eyes, she wasn't just wasting money. She was dishonoring the memory of a man they had all respected. It was a quiet tragedy, and the best thing to do was to look away, to offer a casserole, and to let her be. Time passed. A year, 5 years, a decade. The 80s gave way to the 90s. The price of oil crept back up. A new, smaller boom began, quieter and more cautious than the last one. New technology, like 3D seismic imaging and horizontal drilling, opened up new plays, but none of them were near the Finch Tract. The folly was now an old story, a footnote in the county's history. Elara Finch became a fixture, a part of the landscape like a weathered fence post. 1988. The mesquite trees on her land grew thicker. She bought a new water pump for the house well, installing it herself with the help of a manual from the library. 1991. The county paved the farm-to-market road that ran past her gate. The new blacktop was a stark contrast to her dusty, unpaved driveway. 1995. A prolonged drought settled over West Texas. Ranchers sold off their herds. The land grew brittle. Elara's vegetable garden, meticulously watered with recycled household water, continued to produce. Her small patch of green was a defiant anomaly in a brown, thirsty world. 1999. The world braced for the Y2K bug. People in the cities stockpiled water and generators. In Ector County, life went on. Elara reshingled the south side of her roof, working methodically for a week under the hot summer sun. She was 69 years old. 2003. A new generation of oilmen was running the show in Midland. They had never heard the story of Elara's folly. They saw the Finch Tract on their maps as a blank spot, a piece of the board that had never been in play. Through all these years, Elara lived a life of quiet routine. She was self-reliant to a degree that seemed almost archaic. She did not own a computer. Her television received 3 channels. Her entertainment was the night sky, the change of seasons, the books she ordered through the mail. The bound report from Massachusetts sat on a shelf in her living room, next to a collection of geology textbooks and her late husband's family Bible. She was not a hermit. She went to town for supplies once a week. She was polite but reserved. She never spoke of the soil test. She never hinted at any secret knowledge. She simply waited. She held on to the land. She paid her taxes on time every year. The turn did not come like a thunderclap. It began as a whisper in a research lab 1,000 miles away. It started with a problem. The problem was heat. In the early 2000s, engineers working on hypersonic flight and next-generation microprocessors were hitting a wall. Their new machines generated immense heat that could melt conventional ceramics and warp the most advanced metal alloys. They needed a new material, something that could withstand thousands of degrees of temperature while also being lightweight and electrically insulating. A small materials science company in California called Aerodynamic Materials believed they had a solution. Their research pointed to a rare type of clay, a sodium bentonite, but one with a unique crystalline structure. Standard bentonite was common. It was used in everything from drilling mud to cat litter. But this specific variant, according to their theoretical models, needed to be infused with trace amounts of cesium and lanthanum, arranged in a very particular way within the clay's molecular lattice. Such a material did not exist in nature, they thought. It would have to be synthesized in a lab at enormous expense. Then, in 2006, a young geologist at Apex Consolidated, one of the largest oil companies operating in the Permian Basin, was assigned a tedious task. His name was Peterson. He was 26, fresh out of the University of Texas, and his job was to analyze new satellite thermal imaging data of the basin, looking for underground water deposits that the company could use for its fracking operations. For weeks, he scanned the heat maps, which showed the way the ground absorbed and radiated solar energy. It was mostly uniform, a sea of orange and red. But then he saw it. A small 60-acre anomaly on the western edge of Ector County. A cool spot. A patch of ground that, for some reason, was significantly better at reflecting thermal energy than the surrounding terrain. It was located on a piece of land labeled on the maps as the Finch Tract. It was probably nothing, a data error, a strange surface deposit of reflective caliche. But Peterson was curious. He was a product of a new generation of geologists who used data mining and cross-referencing as their primary tools. On a hunch, he cross-referenced the coordinates of the thermal anomaly with the public database of the United States Geological Survey. He found a single, obscure entry from 1987, a privately funded core sample survey. The entry contained no analysis, only the coordinates, the depth of the samples, and a code for the type of survey conducted. The code was one he had never seen before. He had to look it up in an old USGS manual. It stood for Full Spectrum Mineralogical and Elemental Analysis. It was a type of test almost never used in the oil and gas industry. It was exorbitantly expensive and designed to find trace elements, not hydrocarbons. Now his curiosity was piqued. Why would someone spend a fortune to run this kind of test on a piece of land widely known to be worthless? He started digging. He searched academic databases. For weeks he found nothing. Then he stumbled upon a research paper published in a small, specialized journal of materials science. The paper, written by a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, detailed the unique geological properties of a specific type of clay formation found only in volcanic ash falls that had settled in saline, alkaline lake beds during the Eocene epoch. The paper mentioned that this formation produced a clay with a peculiar crystalline structure, one that was exceptionally good at dissipating heat. It also noted that the formation was often rich in trace deposits of cesium and lanthanum. The paper concluded with a sentence that made Peterson's heart pound. While theoretically significant, this geological formation is believed to be exceedingly rare, with no major known deposits documented in North America. The author of the paper was the same man who had signed the lab report Elara Finch had received in 1987. Peterson felt a sudden, dizzying sense of discovery. He went to his supervisor, then to his supervisor's supervisor. He showed them the satellite data, the USGS entry, the academic paper. At first, they were skeptical. It sounded like a wild goose chase. This was an oil company. They weren't in the business of mining for weird clay. But the evidence was compelling, and the potential applications, if the theory was correct, were staggering. Aerodynamic Materials was just one of a dozen companies in the high-tech and defense sectors desperately searching for such a material. The market would be worth billions. Apex quietly commissioned its own secret analysis. They sent a team out, posing as environmental surveyors, and took a few shallow samples from the roadside near the Finch property line. They sent them not to their own labs in Houston, but to the same independent lab in Massachusetts. The results came back 2 weeks later. The report confirmed it. The Finch Tract sat atop the largest, purest deposit of what the scientists were now calling cesium-laced montmorillonite ever discovered. It was a geological jackpot, a fluke of nature, a multi-billion-dollar resource hidden in plain sight for a century. The land was not worthless. It was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. And a 58-year-old widow had known it for 20 years. Apex Consolidated moved quickly. They sent their best landman, a senior vice president named Davies. He was a man who specialized in difficult acquisitions, a smooth talker with a tailored suit and a disarming smile. The strategy was simple. Approach the old woman, assume she knows nothing, make a generous-seeming offer based on the land's value for grazing and mediocre oil prospects, get her to sign before she had any idea what was really under her feet. It was a standard play from the oil patch playbook. In the spring of 2007, a black Lincoln town car rolled down the newly paved farm-to-market road and turned into Elara Finch's dusty driveway. Davies stepped out of the car, his polished Italian shoes immediately coated in a fine white powder. He straightened his tie and walked up to the porch of the small, well-kept, clapboard house. Elara Finch met him at the door. She was 78 years old now. Her hair was white, her face a map of her years, but her eyes were clear and steady. She was holding a small trowel. She had been working in her garden. She did not seem surprised to see him. She invited him in and offered him a glass of iced tea. They sat at her kitchen table. Davies made small talk. He complimented the house. He spoke of the beauty of the West Texas landscape. He mentioned the recent uptick in oil prices, the renewed activity in the basin. He was patient. He was charming. Finally, he got to the point. Apex Consolidated, he explained, was interested in her property. They were expanding their operations and were looking to acquire land for potential future development. He acknowledged that her tract was not considered prime oil country, but the company was willing to take a chance. They were prepared to make her a very generous offer, one that would allow her to live out her days in comfort, to travel, to do whatever she wanted. He slid a folder across the table. "Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring, "in light of our interest, and as a sign of our goodwill, Apex is prepared to offer you $2 million for your property, all rights, surface and mineral included." He leaned back, a confident smile on his face. $2 million for a piece of worthless land, for an old woman living alone. It was a knockout offer, an act of corporate charity. He expected her to be stunned, to cry, to be overwhelmed with gratitude. Elara Finch did none of those things. She looked at the number on the paper. She looked at the expensive man in the expensive suit, and she laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was quiet, dry, and utterly devoid of amusement. It was the sound of a secret finally being told. It was the sound of a 20-year wait coming to an end. It was the sound of absolute, unassailable vindication. Davies' smile faltered. He was confused. "I'm sorry?" Elara stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the living room. She came back with a heavy, dark blue bound volume. The cover was blank. She placed it on the kitchen table with a solid thud. She opened it to a page in the middle, a page with a complex chart detailing elemental concentrations at a depth of 35 feet. She pushed it across the table toward him. "The soil test from 1987, she said, her voice calm and even. "It proved I was right." Davies stared at the page. He saw the columns of figures, the chemical symbols for cesium, lanthanum, yttrium. He saw the name of the laboratory at the bottom, the same lab Apex had used. His professional composure dissolved, replaced by a cold, dawning realization. The blood drained from his face. She knew. She had known all along. This wasn't a negotiation with a naive old ranch woman. This was a reckoning. The $2 million offer wasn't generous. It was an insult. The men of the county had called it grief. The oilmen had called it folly. The ladies at the church had called it a cry for help. For 2 decades, their simple, easy explanations had defined her. They were all wrong. What they had mistaken for madness was, in fact, a quiet, patient, and unshakable certainty. To understand why Elara Finch laughed that day, to understand how she knew that the worthless dirt of the Finch tract held a secret worth billions, you have to look past the oil derricks and the geological surveys. You have to go back to a dusty geology textbook from 1952, a stubborn mule named Clementine, and a promise she made to her father on a dry riverbed 30 years before that soil test ever broke ground. You have to understand that she wasn't looking for riches. She was looking for proof.